Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR4 memory modules feature customizable multicolor lighting and are designed for overclocking with XMP 2.0 support. Give your build a unique look with vibrant RGB LED memory by Corsair. Click the link in the description for more information.
Excellent!
What's up guys, welcome back to Paul's Hardware, and this my long-awaited Ryzen 5 overclocking video. Now if you purchase a Ryzen CPU from AMD, you should be excited about it because it's new architecture, they're very fast, they're very good price to performance ratios, especially if you compare them to what Intel currently has. But also, all of the Ryzen processors, whether you're talking Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7, or even the Ryzen 3s that we don't actually know much about yet, are all unlocked, which means you can overclock them. And whereas you might not be familiar with overclocking or comfortable with it, this video is going to teach you how to do it. I'm going to show you exactly the settings that I use for a couple basic overclocks myself. I'll give you a couple of tips for overclocking beyond that if you want to get into it, and then I'll give you some closing thoughts on what I think the best bang for the buck is when it comes to these Ryzen 5 processors that are available. But you could, for instance, take something that's less expensive like the Ryzen 5 1400, which you can get for about 170 bucks, overclock it, and then get the performance more in line with what you would get with a Ryzen 5 1500X, which costs about $190. Now, there are other things to take into consideration, like whether or not you get a cooler with your Ryzen 5 processor. You do not, for instance, get a cooler with the Ryzen 5 1600X, the top-of-the-line Ryzen 5 processor that has 6 cores and 12 threads. You do get a cooler, this is the Wraith Stealth, for example, with the Ryzen 5 1400, and then you will get the Wraith Spire, which is a little bit larger. This is a 95 watt TDP cooler versus the 65 watt TDP, and this one will come with the 1500X and the 1600. So buying those processors will mean that you don't have to spend an extra 30, 40, 50 bucks on an aftermarket cooler, although aftermarket coolers will perform a bit better than the Wraith Stealth and Wraith Spire, and you might be able to get a little bit better overclocking out of them. You can overclock with these coolers, you just might not be able to achieve quite as high of a frequency, and you might be running at a little bit higher temperature. So I have all 4 Ryzen 5 CPUs here, the 1400, 1500X, 1600, and 1600X, and since the UI is different for each vendor, I have motherboards from the top 3 manufacturers, specifically from Asus, the Prime B350 Plus and Crosshair 6 Hero X370, from MSI, the X370 X-Power Gaming Titanium, and from Gigabyte, the AB350 Gaming 3. I highly recommend updating your motherboard's UEFI so you have access to the latest RAM compatibility updates. You can download that from your motherboard's support page on the manufacturer's website. As for software, aside from Windows 10, I'll be using CPU-Z and Hardware Monitor to verify that the overclock is enabled and to monitor temperatures. Remember that right now the 2X CPUs, the 1500X and 1600X, will report 20 degrees higher temperatures in the operating system, so just bear that in mind. And I also have Cinebench R15 to test performance improvements, and the IDA64 stress test for stress testing. Before you overclock, definitely run Cinebench at least once to get a baseline score to compare against. And now let's overclock. The 4 main parameters that you're going to want to change when overclocking are CPU frequency, CPU voltage, memory frequency, and memory voltage. You should be able to adjust all of these settings in the UEFI BIOS of any decent B350 or X370 motherboard, and then after you change the settings, hit F10 to save and exit, boot into Windows, load up CPU-Z and Hardware Monitor, and then run Cinebench. If you get through it without crashing, you can then run IDA64's stress test for a few minutes before going back to tweak settings more. To really test stability, you should run the stress test for a few hours or overnight once you've settled on your overclock. Now let's go over the specific settings you should be using. For CPU frequency, you should be able to overclock your Ryzen 5 CPU to between 3.8 and 4.1 GHz. When overclocked, your CPU will run all of its cores at this frequency, as opposed to the out-of-the-box turbo speeds that you'll see listed on the box that only overclocks 2 cores at a time. Frequency is determined by a multiplier, that's a number that you will set, times 100 MHz, which is the system's base clock. So for a 3.9 GHz, we would set the multiplier to 39. For 4 GHz, it would be 40, and so on. That's really all there is to it. On some motherboards, you can adjust the base clock too, but we'll save that for an upcoming part 2 video. Asus motherboards will call the multiplier CPU core ratio, Gigabyte motherboards call it CPU clock ratio, and MSI just calls it CPU frequency. To run your CPU cores at a higher frequency, you're probably going to need to add more voltage. Now, if you can get away with leaving the voltage set to auto or even lowering it, that is good, because higher voltage will produce more heat. Every CPU will be a little different though when it comes to how much voltage is needed to overclock. You can set the core voltage on a Ryzen CPU to between 1.3 and 1.4 volts safely, and AMD actually says you can go up to 1.425, but you shouldn't go beyond that. I personally stick to 1.4 or below for a long-term overclock. Core voltage can sometimes just be punched in manually, like here in MSI's UEFI under CPU core voltage, and then sometimes you'll have an offset option, like with Gigabyte's Dynamic vCore. Here, you can tell it to run at a certain number of millivolts higher or lower than it would normally. Some boards, like the Asus Crosshair 6 Hero, will let you do a manual or offset voltage. A common technique is to start with a higher voltage, manually set it to 1.4, or use an offset setting of plus 0.15 or maybe 0.2 in order to see how high you can get the CPU frequency, then slowly start to back off the voltage a bit at a time until you experience instability in your stress test. With the CPU overclocked, let's move on to memory. There are two ways to overclock memory. The first is to tell your motherboard to read the overclock settings from the memory itself. These are usually called XMP settings, but since XMP is technically an Intel thing, MSI has called this a XMP. There might be one or a few profiles that you can try with slightly different settings. Asus calls this DOCP for some inexplicable reason. I think that stands for damn it, overclock please. And Gigabyte decided that they didn't really care, so they just went ahead and still called it XMP. Since Ryzen can be finicky with some memory modules though, these XMP settings won't always work. So your second option is to manually set the frequency under DRAM frequency or memory frequency. As UEFI updates come out, there will be more options in this dropdown, but right now it goes up to DDR4 3200. Choose a speed that is at or below what your memory is rated for. My Corsair DDR4 3000 kit, for example, I got to run at 2933, and that works with pretty much all the Ryzen 5 CPUs that I've tried. If you want to go a step further here, you can go into Advanced DRAM Configuration and plug in the timings that are listed on the sticker on the side of your memory. Usually it's something like 16, 16, 16, 39. Finally, you will definitely want to increase your memory voltage if you want to hit a higher memory frequency. MSI lists this as DRAM voltage. The default is 1.2 for DDR4, but you can set it to 1.35 almost always without any problems. AMD actually says you can go as high as 1.5 volts, but I usually stick to 1.35. Now, whenever you punch in new settings and reset, there is a good chance that your motherboard will cycle on and off a few times. This is normal, and usually if it tries 5 times or so and it can't boot, it will prompt you with a message, tell you that the overclock failed, and it'll direct you to go back into the BIOS. That is part of the process, and usually it just means that you should try a little bit more voltage or perhaps a bit lower frequency. Once you've settled in on an overclock, I definitely recommend saving it to a profile in the UEFI if your motherboard has that option, and all the motherboards I've used today do have that. And finally, of course, run an overnight stress test with IDA64. So by adjusting those 4 settings, CPU frequency, CPU voltage, memory frequency, and memory voltage, I am very confident that even with a stock Wraith cooler, most of you guys can hit 3.8 or 3.9 GHz across all cores of your Ryzen CPU. Some of you with lucky chips will be able to even hit 4 or 4.1 GHz if you get a chip that overclocks better. But is there more to overclocking than just these basic steps? I think maybe you can get even just a bit more out of your CPU with some slightly more advanced overclocking techniques, and I'll be covering those in a follow-up video coming very soon. So guys, that wraps up for my overclocking guide with Ryzen 5. If you want my opinion on which of these Ryzen 5 CPUs is the best one to go with, I like the R5 1600. You get 6 cores and 12 threads, you get a 95 watt cooler that comes in the box. It costs a good 20 or 30 bucks less than the 1600X does, and you're not hampered by having less L3 cache or anything like that. Now the R5 1400 I think is an interesting option. It is the cheapest out of these bunch. However, you do get half as much L3 cache. You get 8 megs instead of 16 megs. You don't get a 95 watt cooler, you get the 65 watt cooler, and it runs about 300 megahertz slower out of the box than the R5 1500X. So I would opt for the 1500X for 20 bucks more if you have that option or if it's within the budget. But if you're really, really tight, getting the 1400 isn't a bad idea because you do have that upgrade path. And down the line, if the 1400 isn't pulling its weight, if you need more than 4 cores, you can upgrade to a 6-core Ryzen 5 or even an 8-core Ryzen 7 a little bit down the line. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have learned a little bit about how to overclock Ryzen 5. If you have any questions or comments or just feedback on your experience, please leave that in the comment section down below, and I'll be browsing through those to see what you guys think. Of course, the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos just like it coming very soon. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.